Hey guys, in this video I will show you how you can make your very own miniature diorama from scratch. I will share with you the process I use when building and painting them and all the little shortcuts and tips and tricks that I know. If you are into mini painting, I bet that the idea to make a really cool diorama at least crossed your mind at some point, but then you probably dismissed it thinking that it's just too difficult and you won't be able to do it. No cool diorama for you, you have to be satisfied with just looking at other people's stuff on Instagram. Well, last year around this time I decided that screw it, I will just do it. How difficult can it be? And since then I have built 4 of them plus the one I will use as the practical example in this video. And to be honest, it's not the easiest thing in the world, but the process is a lot of fun and it's awesome to just look at them even months after finishing them. So if you ask me, it's absolutely worth it. And if I can do it, then believe me, you can too. And in this video I will share my process and all the tips and tricks I have learned so far so you can have an easier time than I did when I started out. By the way, if you want to know all the details about how I built and painted all my projects so far, you can check my Patreon where I share the detailed PDF painting and building guides and time-lapse videos with a ton of extra footage. So check that out if you're interested, the link is in the video description. Alright, that's enough intro, let's do this. And let's start at the very beginning. How do you come up with the idea that you want to make into a diorama? Where do you get the idea from? Of course, you can just use your imagination and come up with a cool scene yourself, and that is what I did on 3 of my 5 projects. But fortunately, there is an easier way to do this. Instead of coming up with the scene you want to create yourself, you can find inspiration somewhere else. For example, you can recreate a scene from a book, like I did with my GAAHLERI Referral project. Or you can find a cool piece of art and try to recreate that, or at least use it as a reference like I did on my latest diorama using this really cool piece of Warhammer art as inspiration. And of course, you can also just copy someone else's diorama that you really liked, and as long as you don't try to claim credit for it, it's perfectly fine and it's probably the best method when you start out. So if you want to copy one of my dioramas or use them as inspiration, I would be genuinely honored. If you do, please share it with me in some way, I would love to see it. Alright, now we have a cool idea, the question is how to realize it. First of all, I like to select the models that would fit the concept that I have in mind. Having a large pile of unpainted plastic is actually a big advantage here. You can simply look at all your unpainted and unassembled models and see which ones would fit what you need. The trick is not to try to find a perfect model, instead try to be flexible and modify your concept around the models you have, or if you have the experience, kit bash your existing models a bit to better fit the concept. And of course, when you really don't have the thing you need and there is something that fits perfectly, then you can just buy it as well. For example, for my first Infinity diorama, I had the large battlesuit and the pilot that I could use as protagonists, but I needed some wild beasts to attack them, so I went through the Corvus Belli online store and I found the Hungries. And these were exactly what I needed, so I bought a box of them just for the diorama. Now here is something that might not be immediately obvious, but it can be very important. When you select the minis, you already need some idea about the layout of the piece. Most minis are designed with a main viewing angle in mind and they won't look good if you place them facing in a different direction. For example, if you need 2 figures with guns pointing left and 2 with guns pointing right, you need to select models that have that orientation. It can be quite awkward to find out at the assembly stage after having everything painted that you only have one dude who looks good facing left. At this stage, it's also a good idea to think about composition a bit, and don't worry, you don't need an art degree for this, I'm far from an expert in this myself. But you need to at least consider placing your figures somewhat evenly on the scene. For example, don't have most of the models on the left side and leave the other side almost empty. Also, think about which models are your main characters in the scene and place them in central locations, like in the middle of the diorama or somewhere higher up where they will stand out. For example, in my new diorama, the Space Marine Captain and the Sister of Battle are the main characters, so they are placed in the center location surrounded by the orcs on the sides since the boys are comparatively less important, although I wouldn't dare saying that to their face. And on the GAAHLERI Referral diorama, I placed Gaz on the top of the hill with all the other models placed further down. Gaz is the main character in every sense of the word, so he gets to be in a position commanding the most attention on the piece. And that brings us to the base and the backdrop. At this stage you need to decide whether you just want to place the models on essentially a big scenic base or if you also want some kind of backdrop, like the cathedral I went for in my latest piece. In the case of the cathedral, I went through all the terrains I had in my backlog, but I didn't find anything that fit really well, so I decided to find the design online and 3D print it, and it worked out quite well. I'll link the design in the description if you're interested. But if you build or 3D print something, make sure that the size and the scale matches your models, otherwise it might look a little weird. At this stage, it's also important to figure out the size of the diorama and its base. It might be tempting to go really big, but my advice is to make your base barely big enough to have space for all the models in your scene to fit on it. Try not to have a lot of negative space around your models. A couple of small figures in the middle of a huge base look weird, so keep it tight and it will look better and it will be easier to build and paint as well. Finally, a couple more things to consider before we jump into the building phase. Try to insert some dynamism into the scene if you can. Try to avoid models just standing and staring at each other without any interaction. For For example, if you look at the Gasco Tracker diorama, you can see that Makari is standing on the head of a fallen space marine and the squig is running away with the torn off arm of the same guy. On the Age of Sigmar diorama, one of the soldiers is already in the process of getting torn apart by the ghouls, and on the Infinity one you can see the rocket streaking towards the battlesuit from the soldier's rocket launcher. In contrast, I neglected to add a dynamic element to the new big 40k project, and I would argue that it was a mistake and it's worse for it, so I'll learn from my mistake. It's also a good idea to figure out if you want to use some kind of special effect or other trick later on. For example, if you want to have a flying character like I have on the big 40k one, think about how you want to attach him. Finding out that there is no easy way to do it at the assembly stage can be also very awkward. Finally, give some consideration to the color scheme. For example, when I did this latest one, I painted up the individual models and troops separately. But painting them separately means that you have to keep in mind that they will be part of the same scene, so you have to make sure they fit together. But we will talk about that more later in the painting section. Okay, now we have the concept and something like a plan for how we can make it happen. Let's talk about how we can actually build it. First of all, the material we select for the base will determine quite a bit of the building process. So far I have used 3 different materials to build my bases and they all require a very different approach. One of the easiest things to work with is cork. You just need a nice thick sheet of it from which you can then break off the right sized pieces and then carve them to fit the shape you need. An even cheaper method is to use simple tin foil to create the bulk of the terrain. This is the cheapest method by far and it works quite well. Shaping the tin foil can be a bit tricky, but as you can see on the Gasco diorama, I managed it even on my first try. Finally, you can also use modeling foam or insulation foam like I did for the big 40k diorama. This is a bit trickier than the others and you will benefit from having some specialist tools like a hot wire cutter, but it is probably the best method when you want to build something bigger. Although cork and tin foil would still work at this size, I think. One very important consideration when using foam is that it literally melts when it comes into contact with superglue, so use something else for gluing it down. For example, PVA glue works great. When you look at all the dioramas I built, you might notice that most of them feature some elevation in the terrain, and there is a reason for this. If your piece is flat and you look at it from the front, you will only see the models in the front row, which is not great. So to get around this issue, you can create some elevation in the base by stacking layers of cork, for example, or by carving the foam to form an incline. This way the models in the back can stand further up and they will still be visible even from the front. And one very important thing is to dry fit the models on the base while you are making it. Make sure that the size is correct, not too big, but there should still be enough space for all the models. Also make sure that the figures have an actual place to stand in the spot you intend for them. Don't make the terrain too rough or completely uneven where you want the model to stand to avoid them hanging half in space or standing at a weird angle when they are fixed on the base. It is also a good idea to take a picture with the models placed on the base in more or less their final position so you can remember later where they go. If you have any extra bits you want to add to the base, like skulls, bones, stones, or any other objects, this is the right time to glue them on as well, just don't put them in spots where the model's feet go. Finally, when everything is the right shape and size, it's time to cover the surface in some kind of terrain paste. Foam and cork don't really look like ground, but with some modeling paste or simple paper mache spread over it, it's super easy to simulate the texture of ground over them. And when everything is built and the terrain paste is dry, it's time to really bring the diorama to life by painting it. First of all, we need to prime it either with a rattle can or preferably with an airbrush, since you will have a lot more control with it and you also can use it to speed things up later on. I love this step because this one layer of black paint already makes everything look so much better. Up until this point, the whole thing looks kinda like a Frankenstein monster with no hope of ever looking good. But after the priming, it immediately becomes way more cohesive, a single piece rather than a collection of cobbled together parts. I won't talk too much about painting the models. If you're interested, check out the videos about how I painted them for the 40k diorama here on the YouTube channel or in more details on Patreon. Those should give you a good idea about the process. But there are a couple of important things we need to consider before we start painting stuff. First of all, we need to be consistent across all the models and the base. What I mean by that is that there might be figures from various factions on the same scene with very different color schemes. But we still need to make it look like they belong in the same scene and environment, otherwise the end result won't look like a battle scene on an alien planet, but a clown show in a circus. So how do we do that? Here are a couple of considerations that will help you keep things consistent. Don't use different techniques and styles on the same diorama. For example, don't use contrast paints on some figures and normal acrylics on the others, or true metallics on some of them and non-metallic metal on the rest. Consider what kind of environment the diorama represents and paint all the models with that in mind. For example, if it's a dark desert environment, don't make some of the models super bright and desaturated like they are in a winter landscape. Also, it's a good idea to use an environmental effect to tie everything together. It can be something subtle, like for example on the 40k diorama I used a reddish shadow color on everything, including the terrain, which you will probably not notice at first glance, but it helps to tie things together a lot. When you paint the base and the backdrop, you need to take these things into consideration as well, but depending on the size of the diorama, here you might also be facing the issue of having to paint large surfaces. So the question is, how can you deal with that without spending dozens of hours on it? Dry brushing, airbrushing, and contrast paints are your friends here. For example, on the 40K diorama, I first used the airbrush to get some dark shadow colors on the terrain, the same ones that I also used on the models. Then I zenithal highlighted the whole thing using the airbrush and some light gray paints. This allows me to create some light and shadow contrast on everything super fast. Once I was done with this, I used dry brushing to pick out the details on the small elements of the wall sections, plus I also used it to highlight the ground. I would not recommend dry brushing actual models, but on these big terrain pieces and the ground it's perfectly fine, and I will show you a trick later on to mask the typical dry brush look a little. On the cathedral, I used contrast paints and washes to add colors, pick out the details, and add some shading at the same time. If you're familiar with the slap chop technique some people use on minis, then you might realize that this is basically the same thing. I zenithal highlighted the model first, then I picked out the edges with dry brushing, and finally I covered it with transparent contrast paint to preserve the highlights and shadows, so basically slap chop. But since we want our dioramas to look nice and pretty, I usually do two more steps after this. First, I use the brush to add more details by highlighting the edges even further and adding details like texture on the larger surfaces. And this is time consuming and a little skill intensive as well, but it adds a lot of detail to the final piece and it helps to tie the background together with the minis. Finally, to add even more atmosphere and to smooth things out, I usually add some color by spraying thin down paint into the shadows with the airbrush. Coincidentally, this is also a great way to hide the dry brushing a bit. And this might look like some difficult high-level technique, but once you try it out, you will realize that it's actually super easy and it improves the end result a lot. I'm using whole red and dark sea blue here, diluted to about 10-20% paint and 80-90% thinner to make sure that I can build it up slowly and it will be transparent enough to not cover the details, but just tint them. Just try it out using these two colors, spraying the red first and then covering even less inside that with the green-blue in the deepest shadows. You don't even need to understand why, you can experiment with other colors later on once you are more comfortable with this little trick, and I guarantee your diorama will look much better as a result. Finally, if you want, you can also add some cool effect or element on your diorama to really make it stand out. For example, to break up the dull grey of the bricks and sneak some more color into the scene, I decided that the orcs painted a big graffiti over the front of the cathedral at some point. And for reference, painting the whole base from start to finish, but not including the models of course, took me 6.5 hours, which I think is quite manageable for something this big. Cool, let's say we have everything painted now, so it's time for the moment of truth, assembling everything to see how it looks. I usually use only glue to fix the models on the base since I don't really plan on moving them too much. Although in the case of the metal models of the Infinity diorama I used pins, so both methods are valid. Just make sure that the models are oriented properly and they don't lean or turn in the wrong direction. But despite all your best efforts to avoid it, at this point you will likely encounter some issues with fitting things on the base properly. For example, some models might have some gaps under their feet where they are not entirely flush with the ground, or you might want to make some smaller changes to their placement. Don't be afraid to bust out the terrain paste again to fix these issues. It's pretty easy to wait for it to dry and then use the same colors you used on the base to integrate it. It's much better to fix it now than staring at the small imperfection for months and years to come. Finally, you will probably want to add some grass tufts and other foliage to make the ground look more interesting and natural, and if you place this strategically, you can also use them to mask some of the smaller mistakes or imperfections. And there you go, now you have your very first miniature diorama that you can put in your display case, shelf or wall. And once you did one, you will probably want to do some more since now you know how and the possibilities are endless. Hopefully you have found this video useful and it will actually inspire you to build and paint something cool. If that's the case, consider liking the video and dropping a comment as well, it really helps the channel out. And if you make a diorama, I would love to see it, so post it on Instagram and don't hesitate to tag me. And as usual, before I sign off, I wanted to thank my Patreon members for their continued support. They are the ones that make this channel possible. Without them, I wouldn't be able to dedicate the time necessary to keep the channel going. And that is especially true for the ones in the captain level. Thank you guys, see you in the next one.